Jeff Ulbrich said some compelling things about his role in the Falcons' new scheme in his introductory press conference.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every moment more and play more exciting with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. So, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everyday or subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So I am coming from you from an undisclosed location in Mobile, Alabama, on hand for the Senior Bowl. And we'll be talking about the measurables of some of the pass rushers that were announced on Monday and what that means for the Falcons radar and whatnot. We'll talk about Bijan's Pro Bowl snub being rectified. But let's talk about the news on Monday, which is Jeff Ulbrich, the Falcons' new defensive coordinator's introductory presser, and what we learned and what we didn't learn about that. And I think the main thing that we didn't quite learn is sort of a firm decision on what scheme the Falcons would be running, because a lot of sort of speculation on, are the Falcons going to move away from the 3-4 defense? Are they going to move towards a 4-3 defense, as Jeff Ulbrich coached in New York? And unfortunately, I think D-Led was not on hand at the presser, because D-Led would have came out hot with that question. But this time last year, when Jimmy Lake had his introductory presser, he made no bones about it. Definitely going to be a 3-4. Every other Falcons defensive coordinator that has been introduced basically said what Jeff Ulbrich said on Monday, which is, we're going to be multiple. You're not going to be able to nail us down, right? And so we'll see on that. And so it makes me think that the Falcons are not going to be straying as much away from the 3-4 as maybe we had thought, given some of the hires, right? I think they will certainly be incorporating some 4-3 looks into their defense, the occasional wide 9 and all that stuff. But, I think we'll ultimately learn a little bit more about what scheme the Falcons are going to run based off of the types of players that they wind up acquiring later this offseason than anything Jeff Ulbrich said in his introductory presser. As we often say on this podcast, actions speak louder than words. But that became a topic of discussion over the last couple of days, just because of, I think, primarily not because of Jeff Ulbrich hiring as the defensive coordinator, but the hiring of Nate Ollie as the Falcons' new D-line coach, who in his previous 6 years as an assistant in the NFL has coached only 4-3 defenses. And even when you go back to his time prior to the last 6 years in college, like at Tennessee, they were a 4-3 defense. And so, we did discuss previously, when discussing Nate Ollie's addition on Saturday's episode, one of 2 episodes we did on Saturday, that during his 2-year stint as the Indianapolis coach, full-time defensive line coach, he did have a little bit more success developing players that were more of that quote-unquote tweener type, right? Dayo Odeyingbo, Tyquan Lewis, bigger defensive ends that spent a good amount of their time, particularly on pass rushing situations, rushing from the interior, which does kind of overlap a little bit more with your sort of classic 3-4 defensive end than necessarily your 4-3 defensive end. So we didn't get anything definitive on that front today, but I'm sure this will continue to be an ongoing topic of discussion and debate all off season long, as we sit there and we debate, which pass rushers, which players are the Falcons going to be interested in free agency and the draft this offseason. And generally, basically, last thoughts on that is, when it comes to teams, right, the difference between a 3-4 and a 4-3 doesn't really matter. It's a little overrated, right? Again, the multiplicity, the hybrid fronts that most teams run, I don't think it really impacts the team success as much to the degree, but I do think it does impact individuals. Like, certain players are better fits in a 3-4, certain players are better fits in a 4-3. And obviously team success is hinged on getting the most out of your players. And so if you fit, too many square pegs in round holes, you're not going to get as much as another team would, putting those round pegs in those round holes. So other things that stood out to me in Jeff Ulbrich's introductory presser was that he was very candid about his words failures as the interim head coach for the New York Jets this past season. And he's mentioned it multiple times, and been very public about taking on too much responsibility as that interim head coach while continuing to call the defense as a defensive coordinator. And he used that to sort of suggest that it would help him better support Raheem Morris, the Falcons head coach, now that Jeff Ulbrich is back to being a defensive coordinator, because he basically knows how tough that job can be, sort of wearing multiple hats and putting in the hours and all those various things. And so he was also asked point blank about, why is it going to be different this time in terms of the overall defensive success than it was in his previous stint in Atlanta? And I thought he gave a very thoughtful answer for that question, that basically him and Raheem Morris, having departed Atlanta, are different and or better coaches since then. They've grown a lot since then. And I think there's truth to that, right? Jeff Ulbrich specifically has 4 more years of play calling experience that he didn't have in 2020, the last time he was a Falcons assistant and serving as that defensive coordinator when Raheem Morris was the interim head coach for the team that season. The NFL around him has evolved. He's evolved as an individual, and the league as a whole has evolved and changed a bunch in those years. Offenses and defenses aren't really playing the same style of defense or similar styles of defense, but there's a lot more variance in terms of how teams play nowadays than they were playing 4 or 5 years ago. And there'll be a lot more variance on how teams play 4 or 5 years from now. That's just an ongoing thing. So I thought that was a thoughtful and compelling answer from Jeff Ulbrich, And so overall, I think Ulbrich said some thoughtful and interesting things, right? And ultimately, the question is going to be, whatever he says at the press conference doesn't really matter. Not really. Ultimately, he's going to be judged by how him and this team performs on the football field come this fall and winter. But I at least like some of the things that he had to say, right? You can say I've been critical of this hire. I feel like it's more skepticism than it is criticism of the hire. And it's not as if he said some things that make me, I'm all on board on Jeff Ulbrich. And now, I'm singing a different tune, but I thought he said some interesting and compelling things. And you can tell by listening to him talk to the media and how he handled some of the harder hitting questions that they asked him, why he's such a respected coach in this business. And so, we'll see what he can do in this coaching staff. They're going to get to work now. That first step, integrating him and the new coaches into the building as they work to improve this defense. Then they're going to start working on evaluating the players in the building already on the roster and see what they have, and then potentially make decisions about what scheme they want to skew towards, 4-3-3-4, all that stuff. And then they'll get to work on evaluating the new players that they want to add and bring into the building, which may include several players here in Mobile for the Senior Bowl. As I stated, I believe on yesterday's episode, about 80% of the Falcons drafted defensive players have had some affiliation with the Senior Bowl. And so today, on Monday, we got official measurements of some of those defensive front players. Practices will begin on Tuesday, but let's talk about the measurables and what stood out to me as we head into that first practice as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So Super Bowl 59 is here, and we have one game, 2 teams, the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Philadelphia Eagles, and all the endless possibilities that come with it. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook, whether it's predicting that first touchdown, calling the MVP, or betting on the late coin toss. We know that the prop bets are a huge draw for the Super Bowl. And, if you just want to bet, what the spread is, the Chiefs go into this game favored by 1.5 points. Will that line change over the next 2 weeks before that game happens? The Chiefs beat the Eagles last time they faced them 2 years ago by 3 points. So, feeling pretty good. But hey, this Eagles team is better than that team, right? So it's all, available for you if you hang out over at FanDuel. And so all you have to do is download the app at FanDuel.com and get started today. And you can just bet $5. And if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets only at FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, an official partner of Super Bowl 59. So I thought there were some noteworthy Senior Bowl measurements as we focus on these pass rushers to aid, Jeff Ulbrich's new look Falcons defense. And I know some people hear this stuff and say, like, does this really matter? And in my youth, 15 years ago, I used to agree with you. Like, I don't care about the measurables. It's all about the film and all that stuff, right? And we'll see what's what. But I've grown and I've learned that stuff does matter a little bit. Again, it's not the end all be all, but it does matter. It's a part of the evaluation, and you got to understand the context of this, that guy having short arms, that guy being this height or whatever. It does matter for individual players and whatnot, and different positions and all that stuff. So, talking about the Senior Bowl measurables, these aren't the quote unquote official measurables that we will be ultimately judging these players off of, because we'll use the combine numbers later, next month in February, at the end of February, early March. And there will be slight differences, from the Senior Bowl measurables. There always is, like an eighth of an inch here or whatever the case may be. But this gives us a strong foundation, right? And especially, for some of the big guys that we'll talk about a little bit later, you do care about, like, okay, you weighed this much on January 26th. How much do you weigh on February 26th, especially if, staying in shape and conditioning is a concern for you for some of these guys. So, we know this matters for the Falcons just because when it comes to defensive front players, Raheem Morris has been public about this. You can look at Terry Fontenot's draft record and see this as well, that the Falcons do value arm length when it comes to those guys up front. But it's not to the point where it's like, oh, if you have short arms, then you're eliminated from your board. You see that with Braylon twice. Last year, had 12th percentile arm length. Last year, we know that the Falcons were very open about Laiatu Latu being the top edge rusher on their draft board. Last year, he had 16th percentile arm length. So I don't want to sit here and be like, they only care about arm length, but it is one of those things that I think can help break the tie on some of these guys. And, length does matter. As the ladies may or may not say, or whatever the case may be. I'm joking. I'm sure I'm going to get an email about that one. But size does matter. But you saw this in Week 18, right? With the struggles that Caleb McGarry had against Jadeveon Clowney, mostly due to the extension. Let's say that Clowney was able to give Caleb McGarry in that regard. And this stuff does matter, because if you're a little brother or an older brother, right, you may have experienced this one. And this is a silly example, but it's kind of true when it comes to football, the way you can think about it, where your older brother, puts his hand on your head and you're trying to hit him and swing at him and you can't reach him because he has that extra length. And it's basically the idea of, if I can put my hands on you before you can put your hands on me, that does give me a competitive advantage, particularly in the trenches. So, but, it's not the end all be all. You got to know how to use that length, as they say, as the ladies will say, it's not about the size of the boat. It's the motion in the ocean, as they say. But we will leave that aside, guys. So let's talk about some of the guys and where they stacked up. One of the more notable in terms of the edge rushers is Mike Green out of Marshall. He did hit 250 pounds after he had a verified weight last spring of 236. The 32.25-inch arms, though, are, to me, the thing that stands out to me. He's built very similar to Vic Beasley. And that doesn't mean much, in out of context. But, to me, Vic Beasley's lack of length, I think, hurt him as a pass rusher, primarily because he was such a one-note speed rusher. And so that length limited his ability to use his power that he lacked, as well as if he didn't necessarily have the hands to be able to make up for that lack of length. And I don't think that's as big an issue with Mike Green based off of what I have seen from him so far, but we'll get to see that, over these next couple of days at practice. And you contrast Mike Green with Donovan Ezeiraku from Boston College, who measured in at similar size, 6'2", 248, but had 34.5-inch arms, 82-inch wingspan. Both of those numbers put him in the 80th percentile or above for edge rushers. And so I think Ezeiraku does know how to use that length a little bit better and use that as an asset. But, ultimately, I think, the athleticism is going to be the deciding factor. If you're stacking these two sort of players on your draft board, I think Green is a much better athlete based off what I've seen than Ezeiraku, which I think is going to be more meaningful, but we'll find that out, next month at the combine. But, a couple of other edges that don't have the size concerns that Green and Ezeiraku have is Princely Umanmielen out of Ole Miss and Shemar Stewart out of Texas A&M. Princely measured in at 6'4", 265, 34-plus-inch arms, nearly 82-inch wingspan. I think that's a good weight for Princely. His play style reminds me a lot of Will McDonald from the Jets, who Jeff Ulbrich coached these past 2 years, but he comes in about 25 pounds heavier than what Will McDonald was when he was at the Senior Bowl 2 years ago. And we talked about this before. I think Will McDonald was a great pass rusher, 10.5 sacks, gave Laramie Tunsil a lot of problems this past season due to his speed rush. And I think Princely rushes with a similar sort of style, being very much a speed rush forward pass rusher. But Will McDonald was a very limited run defender due to that lack of size. And I think Princely still has a ways to go to improve as a run defender. But at least from a weight standpoint, you won't sit here and say, man, he's a liability against a run like Will McDonald, I think, was at times this year. That did hurt the Jets defense overall due to the fact that he had to play, rather than being sort of that designated situational pass rusher that I think they originally intended for him to be at this stage in his career. He had to be an every down player due to, losing players like John Franklin Myers and Jermaine Johnson and whatnot. And so that is less of a concern, than basically is because of that weight that Princely is at. Shemar Stewart measured in at 6'5", 281, 34 plus inch arms, 83.5 inch wingspan. And he was listed at 6'6", 290 at Texas A&M. Figured he was probably going to be a little closer to 275 than 290 at his listed weight, and he was. And so that's a good size for him, I think. And he's looking more like the quote-unquote edge rusher that I think his play style is. While I think a lot of people have been projecting him more as a 3-4 defensive end, and I think he's probably better suited to be a 4-3 defensive end, especially given nowadays you want to play with heavier edges due to the light boxes that you want to play. On the interior, Walter Nolan measured in at 6'3", 293. That was interesting to me because I thought maybe he might measure in shorter than that, like at 6'1" or whatever, and that's not really a big deal. Low man wins in the NFL and whatnot, so short kings matter. Geno Atkins, Aaron Donald, Grady Jarrett, and Javon Hargrave can attest to that, but the NFL can be a little fickle about that because all of those guys got drafted later than they probably should have because they were a little shorter than what the NFL ideally wants at that position. So that is not a concern for Nolan at 6'3", the D tackle from Ole Miss. But looking at the guys that size is not a concern of, and I think this is interesting to the Falcons because if they are sticking with a 3-4 defense, they may be in the market for a Eddie Goldman replacing at the nose tackle position. And even if they're moving more towards 4-3 looks, adding some more beef in the middle certainly would benefit this defense due to the struggles they had stopping the run this year, in part due to guys not being able to take on double teams and whatnot. And so you look at guys like Deone Walker out of Kentucky, who measured in at 6'7", 340 pounds, 34 plus inch arms, over 84 inch wingspan, a massive human being. And I think 340 pounds is a good weight for him. The height, though, I think with Walker does reflect on the film because I think due to how tall he is, he did kind of struggle with pad level. And one of the things I talked about to the Locked On Falcons insiders in a video breaking down Walker and Nolan and Stewart and Umanmielen and Ezeiraku and Mike Green, all over the last couple of weeks as part of my Senior Bowl prep. Link in description if you want to become a Locked On Falcons insider and get access to that. It is free on a 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month after that. But I talked about with Walker, at least as far as a 3-4 concern, I think he's probably better suited to be a D end than a nose tackle just because he does kind of struggle with taking on those double teams due to that high pad level because of how tall he is. It's harder for him to get low. And we know that low men win. Now, a couple of other big D tackles that are also massive, just like Walker, Yahya Black. I haven't watched him out of Iowa, but measured in very similar, 6'6", 337. Cameron Jackson of Florida measured in at 6'6", 339. Haven't watched him either, but he was a verified 368 last spring. So being 30 pounds slimmer now is a plus in my book. And then Jamari Caldwell out of Oregon, 6'2", 342. Again, another guy that I haven't watched, but I'm looking forward to looking at all of these guys, Black, Jackson, Caldwell, as well as Walker and others this week over the course of the week for the Falcons to potentially add some more beef in the middle. Some guys that I may not necessarily be able to look forward to watching this week are two guys that did not have official measurements come out on Monday, at least as of this recording. That's Nick Scorton, the edge rusher from Texas A&M, Alfred Collins, the D tackle from Texas. Does that mean that they aren't practicing? There was a couple of late additions at edge and in D tackle that you may suggest that, a couple of guys dropped out. And that was something I was very interested going into the week because there were over 160 players that accepted invites to the Senior Bowl. Last year, there was a number closer to like 130, 140 guys that actually practiced during that week. And so we figured there were going to be some dropouts. And I wondered, who among the D-line group might drop out. And so, maybe we usually get an update Tuesday morning on the first day of practice on sort of who opts out. And so I think this may be a strong clue that Scorchin and Collins are going to be two of those guys. But we'll see on Tuesday. I was looking forward to watching both of those guys if they do not show up this week, because Scorton's one of the top edge rushers in this draft class, and Collins, I think, is one of the top interior D linemen, even if I haven't watched him yet. But he also played a lot of nose this past year for Texas, replacing guys like Byron Murphy and T'Vondre Sweat, who went on to have a lot of success this past year in the NFL as rookies. So we will see on that front, talking about guys that, may or may not get some action this week. But one player that definitely is getting action, and I do not mean that as a euphemism, in at least the city of Orlando, will be Bijan Robinson, who will be heading to his first Pro Bowl. And we'll break that down, guys, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So as a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do. And that's where LinkedIn comes in, because when you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in, and LinkedIn's going to make it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, and get qualified candidates all in one place. And when you post your job, LinkedIn has a new feature that can help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And here's a pro tip: add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture to double your reach to qualified candidates. No wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high quality hires. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, let's talk about, good news for Bijan Robinson, who's headed due to Saquon Barkley. He's headed to the Pro Bowl due to Saquon Barkley of the Philadelphia Eagles going to the Super Bowl. Bijan was initially a first alternate at the running back position for the NFC squad at the Pro Bowl games this year. Saquon Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Josh Jacobs were the top 3 running backs voted ahead of him this year. All of them had outstanding seasons, so it's hard to say none of those guys were deserving of their Pro Bowl bids. But of course, we're a little biased here on Locked On Falcons. We think Bijan was just as deserving as those guys, and so now it's finally good to see him get this honor. And if you're sitting here going, well, it's not the same because it's an alternate, or no, it's the same. It counts the same in the record books, right? Whether you got there as an original vote or an alternate, ask Tyler Huntley, you're still considered a one-time Pro Bowler, right? And so Bijan Robinson is now a one-time Pro Bowler, and hopefully this is the first of many Pro Bowls that we will see Bijan Robinson go to in the coming years here in Atlanta. And I said all year long, when it comes to Bijan's performance, he was the best player on the Falcons this past season. I had no notes in terms of his performance, not only as a runner, as a pass catcher, and pass protection, right? He improved the ball security issues that plagued him quite a bit as a rookie. And despite his success and his production, to me, he kind of flew under the radar this season. And this was something that I discussed along with others like Jarvis Davis, Tanitra Batiste, and Tori McElhaney on Locked On Sports Atlanta on Monday morning. But it's worth noting that, Barkley, Gibbs, and Jacobs were all players that played on playoff teams. And I think that's a big factor in why those guys got the recognition over Bijan Robinson. Obviously, no one's going to sit here and be like, I can't, Saquon Barkley, no one saw that, no one's saying that, but you know what I'm saying. So I feel like if the Falcons had not fizzled after their 6-3 start and had continued to play at a high level down the stretch in the second half of the season, you would have probably seen Bijan get voted over, or at least one of those guys, as one of the top 3 running backs in the NFC. So he will be headed to the Pro Bowl game. So, I don't even know what the games are at this point in time. Flag football, beanbag toss, badminton, whatever the games they're playing now at the Pro Bowl, we'll get to see Bijan sort of show his skill set. So that is something that I think is something that we want to see. So, he joins now Chris Lindstrom and Kadero Hodge. We'll see if Jesse Bates gets in, if someone opts out this week. He was also a first alternate there on the NFC squad for the safety position. So I don't remember who actually got in over him at this point in time. And I'm sure many of you guys are yelling at your phone right now. I'm like, it was this guy. I'm like, yeah, of course it was that guy. I forgot all about that guy. It was Xavier McKinney, wasn't it? Yeah, I think it was Xavier McKinney. He had 5 interceptions. He made the free safety spot, if I'm not mistaken, but for the Green Bay Packers. So we'll see. So that is it, guys. We will be back tomorrow, of course, with more coverage of the Senior Bowl down here in Mobile, Alabama. You may or may not see me with Jarvis Davis as well of Locked On Sports Atlanta. He will be arriving on Monday evening and be on hand on Tuesday for these practices. 3 days of practices kicking off Tuesday morning. And so we'll be coming at you guys afterwards, talking about sort of who stood out. Last year came at you on that after that first practice saying, hey, Michael Penix, that then unknown quarterback out of the University of Washington that no one had heard of, wound up being the top guy at that practice. And of course, we went into that week being curious about the quarterbacks because at that time we didn't know who was going to be the guy, right? It was a couple of weeks before we started talking about Kirk Cousins being the Falcons' answer at the quarterback position at the Senior Bowl. And so, we're maybe a couple weeks ahead of talking about, I don't know, Khalil Mack or Von Miller or Chase Young or whatever. Maybe those are going to be conversations that we're going to have in February. But, as they say, the draft starts in mobile, hashtag the draft starts in mobile here. And so this offseason process of looking ahead of sort of who stands out, we're looking for another Keon White. We're looking for another Will McDonald, whoever that is. At the Senior Bowl, the two guys that really shined 2 years ago at the Senior Bowl, at my first Senior Bowl. So I'm looking forward to seeing who sort of shines, who I'm going to hate on. That's going to wind up being, a great pro, as there always is one or two of those guys. So we'll see all about that. But we will be talking a lot more about the pass rushers as well as, DBs, tight ends, offensive linemen, receivers, linebackers. Probably not quarterbacks and running backs. I probably will have some thoughts on those guys if somebody stands out and be like, ooh, that guy's the best player at the Senior Bowl this week. He was killing it or whatnot. But that is all in store for you guys in the coming days. And so we'll be back with more tomorrow. So continue to make us your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, check out Locked On NFL for the latest as well. What's going on with these two Super Bowl matchups, the ongoing coaching search, Locked On Saints, Ross Jackson's out here, doing the Will Smith meme from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air with the last hiring in this cycle. So we'll see what on the Saints. But Locked On NFL, 2 shows daily, going to have you covered for all the big stories around the NFL. Check out Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL Scouting as well if you want to get more additional draft insights from Senior Bowl week as well as the Shrine Bowl. So it is all there for you on Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.